Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Anishinaabe writer, broadcaster, and the newly minted chair of the board of the Canada Council for the Arts, Jesse Wente. Jesse was born and raised in Toronto, and his family hails from Chicago and the Serpent River First Nation. He has become one of the most recognized Indigenous voices in the media. Jesse is the first executive director of the Indigenous Screen Office, which was founded in 2017. In July of 2020, he was appointed for a 5-year term as the new chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. He is the first Indigenous person to be appointed to the position. Jesse, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for asking me, Dennis.
Let's start with your recent appointment as the chair of the board for the Canada Council for the Arts, the first Indigenous person to hold that position. How significant is that?
Well, I guess we'll see, won't we? We can meet again in 5 years and do an assessment. I think it's. I think these things are important. I mean, I often struggle as someone who's had the privilege or opportunity to be the first Indigenous person to do a number of things. I often find it a very uncomfortable place, to be honest, because it's, you go through that door and you're the only one there. And so I'm sort of, to me, the whole idea of first is really only useful if it's the first and then a long line. And that I'm much less interested in being first and much more interested in seeing the 100th, 1,000th, 10,000th, that sort of thing. But I do think it is important that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people take on leadership roles even in colonial institutions, because it's time. And these places do affect us and our lives. And so we, just as any other Canadian, have a right to have the opportunity to help govern and set the agenda for these sorts of places. So I do think it is important that we do take on these sorts of leadership positions, even if it does sit uneasy with me. Being the chair of a crown corporation is not the easiest fit, but again, I think it's important that we take on some of this leadership to make these places better for not just our communities but for all Canadians, and to lend our perspective to these sorts of institutions.
Like you say, you have been on the board for a couple of years already, and you have 5 years to go as the chair here. Are there things that you're hoping to accomplish during that time?
There are. I mean, I'm not. I'm still relatively new to the position. We haven't actually had a board meeting with me as chair yet. So before I'm making any grand pronouncements around what I hope to achieve, I probably want a little more time to pass, set my feet a little bit more. I mean, I think the priorities, on some of them are quite obvious. The Canada Council had its budget doubled in the last 4 years. So I think it's important in a time of the pandemic to ensure that we can continue to offer that level of support to the Canadian cultural sector. We want to make sure that we continue to evolve our programs to meet the needs, especially now when artistic practice is inevitably going to have to change because of the pandemic. So to make sure that the Canada Council is able to react and be nimble enough to adapt to the new set of circumstances, and also very much to continue the work that we've seen in terms of their support of Indigenous artists and Indigenous cultural organizations, but also the Black community, all marginalized communities. One of the mandates under the strategic plan that the council's just wrapping up now was to bring in more people that hadn't been clients of the Canada Council previously for whatever reason, and to bring those people in and to have them become engaged with the organization. And we've been incredibly successful doing that so far. And that to me is what a public arts funder should be doing, is seeking out the communities that, for whatever reason, haven't engaged with them, and try to engage with them, to build that relationship and to build that trust, so that we can actually grow what is considered Canadian culture, what is funded by the Canada Council of the Arts, and build the appreciation, audiences, and the artistic practices that support all of that. So a lot of that is really just supporting what the council's already doing, but maybe expanding it and helping it be nimble in this very particular and specific moment.
And this moment, the pandemic has been extremely hard on the arts and those involved in it. What are some of the stories you're hearing, Jesse, of the troubles people are having?
I mean, whether it's through my role at the Canada Council or through my roles at the Indigenous Screen Office, we've been hearing a lot. And, both organizations have responded. So the Canada Council is in the midst of its second phase of relief funding. This is targeted specifically at Indigenous and BIPOC artists and cultural organizations. The Indigenous Screen Office, which is another cultural organization that I'm the executive director of, we're just finishing, or we just launched and are coming to a resolution in our own COVID relief aid for Indigenous artists in the screen sector. We are dispersing $3 million in relief aid. And a lot of that, Dennis, really, if we're really honest, is about keeping people in the sector. That my biggest fear, and what the stories that I hear, is that because the arts have shut down, and because so many people that are employed as artists who work artistic practices are freelancers, they're not employees of a company. They may not have been either eligible for the ERB, the CERB payments early on, or they're going to run out. The real fear that I think a lot of I have as a arts leader or arts and cultural person, is that people will just leave the sector. They'll stop being artists, or at least professionalized artists. And for Indigenous peoples, we are already such a small part of the sector that any loss would be dramatic and deeply felt. And we're at a moment, one of the things, Dennis, that we sometimes forget when discussing arts and culture, especially from the Indigenous side, is that before the pandemic, there was a tremendous amount of momentum in terms of Indigenous peoples and artists and organizations, where we were going, the awards our artists were winning, the growth that our artists were seeing, that the organizations were seeing, and all of that is under threat now. And we have to make sure that we don't lose that momentum, even as the larger sector is now hurting as well. We can't go back. We were on the path towards a more equitable arts and culture sector in Canada. We can't backtrack just because of COVID. In fact, what we have to do is double down, because the success, the recovery of marginalized artists, marginalized organizations, and those communities will speak to how well the larger population has recovered as well. If those places disappear or struggle even more after COVID, then we've actually failed. And we need to make sure that that's not what happens. This is a moment where we should be increasing investment in those communities, into those artists and those practices, not having it threatened, because that's what recovery will actually look like, especially if we want that recovery and rebuilding to be more equitable than it was when these systems and structures were originally built.
Canada to be a little more comfortable with discomfort. Because, of course, Indigenous people, we're uncomfortable every day. So if we're going to share, let's share some of that too. Because we've shared an awful lot so far, including where we sit right now. So we can share a little of our discomfort for a Canada that has become so comfortable over the years.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Jesse Wente, who is one of Canada's most prominent and recognizable Indigenous voices, who's been a long-time pop culture columnist as well. You've been involved in so many projects over the years and a columnist for many years, but you've also been a fierce critic of the media. Has there been times when the two collided for you?
Yeah, all the time, Dennis. Probably the one that's most public was around the Appropriation Prize debate that happened in 2017, in that there was someone, an editor or producer at the time at the CBC, was involved in that, and I went on the CBC to be critical of them. And to be honest, it's the reason I felt safe doing that was that I've been a freelancer with the CBC for many, many years. It's been since 2006, I want to say, that I've freelanced with the CBC. So that's a bit of a different relationship than when you're an employee. And so for me, the important thing was speaking the truth, and speaking the truth to them. And if that cost me my job, fine, and it hasn't. And frankly, I mean, in the early days of all media, this has been standard. I remember I came on APTN once and criticized APTN. So it's happened. Because I think the media and storytelling is so important. I think it shapes so much of how we understand each other, the world, ourselves, what's happening out there. And that I think, especially in the age of social media, the rules of accountability, or how media is held accountable, has radically shifted. It used to be that, at best, you sent a letter to the editor, and it was up to that editor whether they even printed it. So newspapers and media could completely deflect or bury criticism of what they were doing. They can't now. But I also think it's important that they sometimes, when it came to criticizing specifically the CBC, as someone who's worked with them for 25 years, it was very important that, to me, that they hear it from someone who they considered their own, because sometimes that can be effective. And I even use that more broadly in the media, as someone who's now been in the media very publicly for so long. Sometimes it takes one of us to criticize the media in order for them to listen. Hear it from someone who's actually been where they've been. I've been in a newsroom. I've been on the assignment deck. I've produced national shows. I've produced local shows. I've done all of it. And so sometimes that experience is actually the correct point to criticize from. And we shouldn't be silent even when our own institutions do those things. And the CBC is a public broadcaster. And so I do think that means that it should be held to a pretty specific standard, and that it maybe should be more accountable than those broadcasters that are private broadcasters, at least because of that dynamic between a public and private sort of organization.
Do you think there are risks, though, for journalists out there, particularly maybe new or only around for a couple of years, of speaking out?
Yes, enormous risk. This is, again, why I did it, was because I was a senior columnist. I've been privileged to be on the air for so long. My column, is popular. I'll be honest. I don't often say that, but very popular. And so the CBC has given me a lot of freedom and a lot of room to say things that others haven't on their airwaves, even about them. And so I see that, I take that responsibility, the privilege of having given that space on the radio, that 5 minutes of space on the radio that I've had for 20 plus years, to take that space and to use that so that others that don't have that privilege, that are just starting out, that aren't in a place where they can lose the job. I could lose the job. Maybe they couldn't. That's when you should step up, is to put yourself in the path so that others that can't take that risk don't have to. And so, yes, that's why I think we're seeing, there's this big reckoning happening in newsrooms right across Turtle Island, where all of this history is coming out, and we're hearing about the treatment that so many people of color, Black and Indigenous people have suffered in these institutions, it's important that those of us that have been there for very long put our names to those efforts, that we don't just allow young people who have so much more at risk to do all that work. We have to do that work because we're the ones that can afford to take that risk. And so, yes, I do think it is very risky. It's not nothing I recommend for people that are just starting out on their careers. And in fact, I think what's important is for news organizations to start taking on to empower those young people, to give them the space in a safe way. You know, the Toronto Star just introduced an internal ombud specifically meant for racialized employees to take concerns to them. That means that they don't have to speak to their manager, that someone else can be in their corner. They can do it anonymously. And I think we need to see a lot of organizations do similar things. Luckily, that role has been taken on by a columnist who I deeply admire, Shri Pedarkar. I'm going to mess her last name up. But Shri's been working, you know, in this area for so long. She's a great leader in this. We need to see news organizations do that so that the junior employees, when they face those issues, can feel that they have a safe place to air them. And it's not a coincidence that Shri, who's very senior, is the one doing that, because maybe she has protection that they don't. And so I actually think we need to make the space for organizations to do that, so that staff can come forward and not face repercussions, and that you don't have to build a 20-year media career on air, so that's what protects you, because it shouldn't require that, you know, to do this work.
At the end of last season, we had Wabgishik Rice on, who was just kind of wrapping up for the time being anyways, his journalism career, to focus on some other things. And, you know, we talked about that yardsticks have been moved, and I'm sure you've seen that in your 20 plus years. But what more do you think needs to take place here?
Well, I mean, listen, when I started at the CBC in downtown Toronto, I want to say there was like 3 Indigenous people in the building. And there's many more now. There's an entire CBC Indigenous platform. When I started in media, APTN did not exist. I couldn't have worked for APTN when I started because there was no such thing. So, I mean, the fact that APTN is celebrating, I think, an anniversary fairly soon is, to me, just a symbol of how much progress we've made. That you and I are having this conversation, Dennis, is an indication of how far we've come. But that doesn't mean that we've arrived, you know, that there's much to be done. From my vantage point, I think for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, I think it's important that we always center sovereignty and self-determination as the goal, you know, because that's what we are as peoples, and so we should be trying to achieve that even in colonial institutions and in capitalist systems. I think for all racialized people, we need way more accountability, transparency, and we need to really challenge some of the power structures that exist. You know, representation on screen or behind the microphone or in the pages is very good. But the truth is, while we've made great strides in Canadian media for on-screen or on-air representation, the behind the scenes, the executive teams, the CEOs, the board of directors, the senior editorial positions are still not very diverse at all, if at all. And same with columnists, of which I'm one on radio. Columnists is like the primo spot. Very few racialized folks get those sorts of positions. We need to see those things change as well as more support for grassroots media and independent media, because we also have to admit that some of these institutions will never serve us necessarily in the best way. So we also need to create the supports. This is why I do work at the Canada Council to help an existing colonial institution do better. And I also build with the Indigenous Screen Office our own institution so that we can have both, because we need both. We need those that exist to do better, and we need to build new things from the ground up that, with this as their focus, that can create a new way of doing things. And I think we need both of those things to truly see the change that we all need.
That's a good blueprint there. Jesse, we do have to just step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. To listen to an extended version of this interview with Jesse Wente, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is writer, broadcaster, and chair of the board of the Canada Council for the Arts, Jesse Wente. Jesse, you're a longtime film and pop culture critic. Of course, we're only seeing the return of movies in theaters now, but who knows how long that will last. Of course, Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum, which was released near the beginning of the pandemic, was well received in Canada and the U.S. Elmaya Tailfeather's The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, Canadian Screen Award nominations and wins. How would you describe this time and place for Indigenous filmmaking?
I think we're entering another golden age, to be honest. When I look back at Indigenous cinema history, we had a sort of golden age around the late 90s, early 2000s, when we really saw a great increase in the number of Indigenous storytellers. Ada Narjawat, those sorts of movies came out. Now I think we're really seeing Indigenous filmmakers tackle genre. You had Jeff on your show. Blood Quantum, an awesome movie. Everyone should see it. Zombie movie. We're going to get more of that. We've got, Danis Goulet's got a film coming out, Night Raiders. There's a Inuit sci-fi movie, Slashback, coming out, and the Toronto Film Festival, which is going to have premiere its sort of new version, a COVID version, later this month. They've got a great new film by Tracy Deer called Beans, about her experience at the Ganasatake, Ganawage resistance, 30 years ago, what Canada calls the Oka crisis. So I think it's an amazing moment for Indigenous cinema, Indigenous television, and only getting better. I think that's the beauty, and hopefully the ISO can play a part in accelerating that progress. But yeah, I think it's an amazing time to be a storyteller, Indigenous or otherwise, but specifically Indigenous. I think the sky's the limit.
Well, it looks like we'll have some things to look forward to watching in the coming months then. Unfortunately, Jesse, that's all the time we do have for this week. Really appreciate you coming on the show and doing this for us. So,
Miigwech so much, Dennis, for having me. And I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. This is a really important show. I'm very honored to be on the show. And I just want to thank everyone at APTN who's been working through the pandemic, and it does such incredibly important work for our community. Miigwech, 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 chi miigwech.
Appreciate that, Jesse. It means a lot coming from you. Sadly, that is all the time we have for this week, but you can catch up on any of our past episodes you might have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. All of the shows are available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.